Hello, I'm Kenneth Steinbach. I'm the artist who created the I Love Only You installation. I've done a number of projects using altered currency, and by far the most common question about them is whether it is illegal to alter and destroy the currencies in this way, particularly the American dollar, and whether I'm worried that I will get into trouble about it. My response is usually, I certainly hope so. It would be quite an experience, I think, to have the Secret Service burst in and arrest me for making art in this way. It's an event that would I certainly put at the top of my resume. But I find this concern about legality fascinating in the way that it points to larger issues about the place that currencies hold for us. To my mind, currencies represent one of the strongest examples of Ellul's idea of technique, which is a series of interconnected behaviors and values that tend to dominate any system into which they are introduced. I think it is apparent that technique shapes not only social spaces in our monetary relationships, but personal and spiritual ones as well. The start of this series of drawings was a thinking about neoliberal economic policies and the ways in which the, quote, invisible hand of the marketplace has often been given a level of faith and trust one usually finds only in religious belief. This is in spite of the ways in which these systems have repeatedly shown themselves to be simultaneously helpful and destructive to human relationships, both community building and community destroying, and a vehicle for both individual freedom and individual bondage. The imagery used in these currencies and the currencies themselves are from failed and discarded monetary systems from across the world. Some of these have been well-known spectacular failures, such as the instances of hyperinflation in pre-World War II Germany and contemporary Zimbabwe, but most are just run-of-the-mill failures, the result of political upheaval or shifting economics, or simply a redesign to represent more current realities. For this series, I referenced a lot of American pre-Civil War Confederate currencies. At that time, it was common for states and even banks and railroads to issue their own currencies. I focused a lot on the figures in those currencies, a few of which were allegorical figures representing valor or victory, but most were images of people involved in some kind of manual labor, from loading goods onto carts, leading cattle, carrying buckets, and picking cotton. The drawings use several media, the most prominent being a laser cutter that literally burns the figures into the paper. It's an unusual way of drawing that to me evokes a level of intensity or even violence that seemed necessary. The drawings use a lot of bilateral or left-right symmetry, which is a visual foundation for almost all currencies. Such symmetry is used to convey stability and authority. We can see it in architecture, for example, in structures that represent power, such as government buildings, religious structures, banks, and so on. Organic forms are also present throughout the artworks, images that evoke the splitting of cells or a pervasive field of dots that appears an invasion of a virus. In this way, the drawings play with notions of order and disorder, power, violence, and stereotype. To quote the music producer Brian Eno, it's helpful to think about art as generating experiences rather than communicating specific meanings. When I was interviewing dozens of mid-career artists for a recent book about artistic practice, I found that they were not simply interested in making product or communicating specific ideas or even in the notion of personal expression, but from a position that art is first poetic, which is to say largely untranslatable and eluding any easy descriptions. The artist does not make the work to express what they think and feel, but makes the work to engage and wrestle with what they think and feel, and the artwork is an artifact of that process. It is a reality that looks confoundingly strange from the outside. As the artist Anselm Kiefer said, I'm looking to be surprised. Not surprise for its own sake, but the surprise of new ideas and new forms of aesthetic logic that are activated through the process of making and viewing artwork. Ellul is a product of his era in thinking about art in terms of what it might communicate, often in a very literal way. In this way, he was like most writers at that time, which tended to minimize the making of the work as incidental or even irrelevant to its meaning, as mundane as a Detroit assembly line. We can forgive them some of these omissions, as contemporary art and art criticism were fairly young at that point. It is important, however, to reorient our thinking about art. It is not simply communicate or for communication, it's a written, irreducible poetic act. To define it principally in terms of what it communicates is to make itself another victim of Ellul's technique. To return to the question I mentioned at the beginning, It's not illegal to alter or destroy currencies. You can shred dollar bills all day long on the steps of the Federal Reserve, and you'll only get a ticket for littering. But we might reflect on the fact that these value systems, the technique that Ellul described, have become so ingrained in us that we find the destructive act deeply transgressive. We have internalized technique to a profound degree, and our reaction to such a destruction is very telling. The more I consider that as I'm making these works, the more I find myself deeply uneasy about the pervasive ways in which this kind of technique has impacted my life. Thanks very much. Happy to answer some questions.